So before we bring on Amber, Paul, you and I had sort of wanted to, I think, offer, I guess, a small defense of the public sector and also, of government programs, because I think a lot of the theory and a lot of the intellectual framework behind mutual aid is very hostile to the state or hostile to state intervention. And, to be clear, I'm not saying that that's everybody who participates in mutual aid or supports mutual aid. But, when we think about some of the leading theorists or the leading scholars who are advocates of mutual aid, you often hear that. So one example is the legal professor, Dean Spade, who is the author of the recent book, Mutual Aid, Building Solidarity During This Crisis and the Next. He makes a case for mutual aid partly by relying on what I think is a pretty specific interpretation of the New Deal. And I just want to read a line from a recent interview that he conducted. So in this interview, he said, "A lot of people fantasize about the New Deal, but the state always uses its administrative capacity to articulate racialized gender control, extraction, and maldistribution. Social Security was created to exclude domestic workers and agricultural workers and to undercompensate women workers. These things are not by accident, they are by design." And, when it comes to the New Deal, I think that among both, liberals and leftists, I think that there really is this popular conception that the New Deal was racially exclusionary, right? So the political scientist, Ira Katznelson, I think he's one of the main proponents of this idea. He famously called the New Deal a form of, quote, affirmative action for whites. And I think, like I said, a lot of people are sort of familiar with this argument that, racist Southern Democrats during the New Deal era forced these sort of carve-outs in certain programs in order to exempt Black workers from certain benefits or, to otherwise preserve the racial hierarchy, right? And again, I think that there is an element of truth there. Obviously, the New Deal by no means was perfect. It was by no means free of discrimination. However, that said, it's just not the case that it only benefited white people. So, I think the classic example that people kind of latch onto when they are talking about the shortcomings of the New Deal is Social Security, right? Social Security was famously a program that exempted domestic workers and agricultural workers when it was first created. And, those workers were disproportionately Black. So again, I think the popular narrative is that racist Southern Democrats, that clear in some ways that that's what happened. So Larry DeWitt, who is a historian of the New Deal and of Social Security in particular, he actually has a paper, I think, from a few years ago where he looked at a lot of the historical records and the documentation sort of surrounding the creation of Social Security. And he found that the big push for excluding domestic and agricultural workers actually didn't come from the Southern Democrats. It came from the employers in those sectors, and their lobbies. So like the American Farm Bureau and other kind of, like I said, employer sort of lobbying groups who said that, well, the Social Security tax on these industries is going to be too burdensome. So we just can't do it. And of course, the Southern Democrats obviously use their leverage to press for other concessions in the New Deal, but based on, quite a fair bit of evidence, it doesn't look like Social Security was one of them. And I also want to mention, and Adolph Reed talks about this quite a lot too, it is that whites made up I think something like 75% of domestic and agricultural workers at the time. So, Blacks were, of course, disproportionately represented among those workers. But most of the workers excluded in the beginning from Social Security were still white, right? So I guess, if this was supposed to be kind of this program of racial exclusion, then there was a lot of collateral damage.
Right.
Yeah.
And then, if I could just also put in there, the idea that these reforms were just racial designed to be racially exclusionary, it doesn't make sense when you look at, all the benefits extended to industrial workers under the National Labor Relations Act. And, that was the first time that many Black unskilled workers could gain access to these benefits. So, wouldn't it make sense if you're trying to exclude from agricultural workers, not to also exclude from industrial workers in the North, because that's a huge swath of Black people as well. So, and there's also a lot of evidence about, in some of these industries in agricultural work, wanting to maintain certain managerial prerogatives that Social Security would kind of take away that sort of carrot and stick approach that they were able to use. And that was kind of more of a motivating factor than, I'm sure, I don't doubt at all that many of these
someone
people
was racist.
Yeah, I don't doubt at all that many of these people, that had owned land in the South were incredibly racist at that time. But,
Right.
I think keeping that managerial prerogative, which again, they had over in total more whites than Blacks in general, was kind of a bigger part of the story.
Mm-hmm. I also want to mention, just following up on something that you just said, that the historian Touré Reed, in his book Toward Freedom, he actually points out that a lot of the labor reforms during the New Deal era sort of provided the blueprint for some of the civil rights era reforms that would come later, and kind of created a foundation for Black labor leaders such as your fave, A. Philip Randolph, and others. So that's kind of another way in which, the New Deal was obviously in many ways this sort of unfinished or incomplete kind of program, which, as I said before, did have its problems with discrimination and being not reaching as many people as it should have, particularly Black people in the US at the time. But, kind of planted the seeds in other ways for other reforms that would come later. And on the subject of Black people benefiting from the New Deal, something else that Adolph Reed talks about, he writes about this in the New Republic, but I think he's also mentioned this elsewhere, is that, relative to their portion of the population, so like Black Americans were something like, less than or roughly 10% of the US population during the New Deal. But by the end of the 30s, they made up 15% of the Works Progress Administration, around 11% of the Civilian Conservation Corps, and 30% of the Public Works Administration. And, the caveat there, I guess, is like, obviously Black people were disproportionately represented among the poor and among the unemployed, which of course were the very sort of groups that the New Deal was designed to help out. And Adolph, I think, makes the point that they probably should have been represented even more. Like, there should have been even more numbers of Black workers within those sort of national jobs programs. But the fact remains that, lots of Black workers did benefit, Black families did benefit. And again, I think the point that, I just want to sort of get at is the New Deal, as I said before, in many ways was incomplete, obviously. But I don't think that's the same thing as calling it a failure. I don't think that we have to, toss out the baby with the bathwater on this one. And just to kind of touch on something I said earlier, New Deal reforms also provided a blueprint for other social provision that would come later. And I know that you want to talk about the public sector and some of the more like later 20th century reforms as well.
Yeah, and just one more thing on the New Deal. If you're going to take the line of dismissing it because it was just overwhelmingly racist, someone has to explain, why did Black voters' loyalty switch overwhelmingly from the Republican Party to the Democratic Party? The Republican Party, the party of Lincoln, aka the party that got us out of slavery. So, there really is basically one explanation for that, and that is the New Deal. So, and again, I'm sure, I don't think you needed to tell any Black person at that time that, things were not working out totally equally with the New Deal, but clearly they're getting something out of it if they're switching their party loyalties so dramatically, and it wasn't just about, yes, FDR, I think, opened up some more space in terms of like appointing Black people in the cabinet, but also, many civil rights figures at the time, including like A. Philip Randolph, also said like they were actually disappointed in the Black people did not necessarily get that much more access to the administration or that much more meetings, with groups like the NAACP. So it was overwhelmingly seeing this benefit from New Deal programs that switched that loyalty. And, you'd have to explain that if you're going to take this firm line that it was just racist, dismiss it, and it's just, history is not that cut and dry, to dismiss something like that.
I want to read really quickly a quote from Preston Smith's recent article in Catalyst, because I think that he kind of like sums it up perfectly. So he writes, "The defensible claim that Blacks did not receive their fair share from the New Deal often morphs into the charge that they did not receive any benefits at all. In other words, the race reductionist criticism of the New Deal goes from racial discrimination to racial exclusion. The slope is admittedly slippery, and race partisans end up discrediting the public goods approach that the New Deal featured during the 1930s and 40s, rather than zeroing in on the limitations imposed by resurgent capital." So I just really like that kind of summary of what we just discussed.
Yeah, and with the public sector, I guess I'll start by saying this: if there's any sort of candidate or politician or organizer or so-called leader that talks about a so-called Black agenda and front and center is not the public sector, they're really not talking about anything. And you can look historically, every time Black people have made significant progress, it has come with an expansion of the public sector, public employment, federal employment. You can look at Reconstruction, the New Deal. Even in the 1960s, along with the obvious civil rights legislation, part of that Civil Rights Act was, employment legislation banning discrimination. And the public sector has always had better enforcement of discrimination. So it has been historically, even going back to right after the Civil War, a safe haven for Black workers. And in many ways, it's a critical lifeline. I don't think people realize that for so many working class Black people, it is the dividing line between some kind of wealth stability and poverty and desperation. So I'm going to throw up a quote here by a fellow named Paul Prescod.
Who's that?
Shameless. But I think it's an important point to highlight. So 20% of Black workers are employed in the public sector, which means they are disproportionately more likely to be found in public employment. With around a third of the public sector unionized, these jobs are more likely to offer stability, a living wage, and strong benefits. On the whole, Black workers in the public sector make almost 25% more in wages than their counterparts in the private sector. And I think that really says it all. If you're not talking about saving the public sector, Black workers are really going to be hurt in that situation. And I'm going to play some videos here. I think the Postal Service is one of the best examples of this. It is over 400,000 union living wage jobs. 21% of the postal workforce is Black. So again, disproportionately Black. Historically, it has been the safe haven for Black workers. So I'm going to play two things. One of them is from the famous actor Danny Glover, who was a Bernie supporter, but he is the son of two postal workers. And then second clip is going to be the president of the Chicago branch of the National Association of Letter Carriers. And they really get into like how much meaning Postal Service jobs, and I think public sector jobs overall, have for Black people and Black communities.
When I was growing up in the 1950s and 1960s, my community was the postal employees and union officers. To this day, I still run into people who remember my dad, James Glover, a postal worker who was indispensable to the life of the community. For Black families like mine, the Postal Service has long been one of the few reliable paths to the middle class. My parents were so proud in 1957 when they had saved enough money from working there to buy a house.
And that story, you can multiply that story tens of thousands, million times across the country. And that reflects the experience of so many Black people in this country. And so again, this second clip, this is the current president of the Chicago branch of the National Association of Letter Carriers, kind of talking about the new hires he sees and what postal employment means to them.
As president of the local here, I have an opportunity, and I make it a point to go to every orientation of all the new hires. And the fact of the matter is, many of them come from, the inner city communities, financially challenged communities, and they see the Postal Service as a great opportunity. And I tell them that, that their life is going to change. because of their employment with the Postal Service. And I have actually seen firsthand that transformation. I've seen people come in and, when I tell them that one day you're going to be a homeowner, or when, you're going to own cars, you're going to do all the things that you see other people who work for the post office do, they're very encouraged by that.
So, it's a very real thing. It's a very visceral thing that many Black people understand. And so again, anytime you expand the public sector, expand the federal government, it is going to benefit Black people. And that has to be like a key part of our program and our perspective on the left. Even with the Great Society, now the Great Society was not even as good as the New Deal, but you saw Black people really benefited economically from that expansion of federal employment that came with the Great Society. And when you combine that with affirmative action laws that were in place, Blacks made sure that they got a good share of those stable jobs. I mean, just think about any city with any substantial Black population. I mean, look at the public transportation workers, public education workers, sanitation workers, federal employees. They're going to be disproportionately Black. And there is a historical reason for this. And so I guess, to kind of tie this into mutual aid, I mean, what I fear with how I hear a lot of people on the left talking about mutual aid is I hear a lot of times people kind of acting like we are going to replace the state through mutual aid. First of all, I think that's delusional. And I think our task, what we should be thinking about in this moment, is rebuilding that public good mode of governance and defending the public sector. And, I think there's no more anti-racist thing you could be doing right now than defending the public sector. And because, again, it's empirical. Like, it is an empirical fact that the public sector has been the best mitigator of Black poverty over time. So I think on the left, we should be seeing our tasks right now, because we're hearing already, I think the Economic Policy Institute put out a forecast that like over 5 million public jobs are going to be eliminated if austerity goes through. Every city and state is talking about cuts again. We should be going all in to defend the public sector and expand it. And at the same time, knowing that while we're doing that, we are defending a critical lifeline for Black people. They call it the Black middle class. I mean, I would argue it's a sector of the Black working class. But, this is just the critical line of stability for Black communities and, of course, many other communities. So, when we frame mutual aid as like, well, this is the state is collapsing, we're filling in the gaps, we're preparing ourselves to take over the state, I think that's missing the key fight we should be kind of gearing up for. And I think it's a very different version of preparing ourselves to be in the state than traditionally, where it's like having a left party that can get in government and implement reforms over time, which of course is a much harder, longer process. But that to me is the real work of like preparing to govern, preparing to run the state.
I also want to point out, just in contrast to, everything you just laid out, so many of the kind of proposals for anti-racism, especially anti-racism in the workplace that we're now hearing from the Biden administration to, other Democrats, have to do with the private sector. So it's like diversifying corporate boards, right? Or like instituting, anti-racism or like diversity training, mostly in the private sector, in the corporate sector. And you don't really hear, or at least I haven't heard Biden talk much about reinvigorating the public sector, which, as you point out, is kind of the most crucial thing to do right now, especially as budgets are sort of being cut and being tightened. And the other thing is, Paul, we've talked about this before. There's been a sort of proliferation of like anti-racism think tanks and like anti-racism centers where, the idea is like, well, we really need to study this problem and really figure out a way to sort of help like uplift, Black Americans. And I mean, you gave an answer. So
Right.
maybe we don't need quite so many anti-racism centers.
Yeah, I mean, again, they want to complicate a problem that is really not that complicated conceptually. And again, I mean, look in history, going back to Reconstruction, if you provide public employment and the laws of anti-discrimination are enforceable and are strong, you're going to see a growth in stable Black employment. So I think that is the task today. And, I think mutual aid has a way of framing this problem that's not on the best terrain for us. And I think doesn't make sense for many people that, again, it's a thing in Black communities, like understanding public employment and its role, and wanting that to continue in future generations. I don't think mutual aid really taps into that sentiment that is there among many working people.
And again, just to go back to something you mentioned when we were talking about the New Deal and how Black Americans overwhelmingly supported FDR and the New Deal, likewise, I think today Black Americans are more likely than their white counterparts to say that they want Medicare for all, to say that they want stronger government social services. So there's no, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it doesn't seem like there's a huge groundswell of support, among Black Americans for turning away from the state.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think a lot of people who love to beat on FDR and even Lincoln would probably cringe if they read some quotes from actually very militant civil rights leaders from the 30s, 40s, and 50s and how they spoke about FDR in pretty glowing terms. Because again, I mean, they understood the reality of the significant change that took place, regardless of FDR's personal views on race, which were probably terrible, and they understood that. But they understood the significance, and even people like Martin Luther King Jr., Bayard Rustin, A. Phil Randolph understood the significance of Lyndon Johnson, even with all his flaws. You don't have to glorify him, but just understand that there are opportunities with that framework.
Right.